It is the 4th of August, 1943. On a frozen lake deep in the Canadian Rockies, hidden beneath the towering peaks of Jasper National Park, a strange wooden shed sits on the ice. Inside, a handful of laborers work in near silence, stacking blocks of something that looks like ice but does not behave like it. They have been told almost nothing about what they are building. Most of them are conscientious objectors, men who chose alternative service over the trenches, now performing a different kind of war work entirely, one so secret that even they do not understand its purpose. Above them, the Rocky Mountains keep watch over a body of water called Patricia Lake, chosen specifically because almost nobody ever comes here. Inside that shed, hidden from German reconnaissance and from most of Britain's own military command, the Allies are quietly building a prototype aircraft carrier, not from steel, not from aluminium, from ice. The vessel taking shape is barely a fraction of what its designers imagine. The final ship, if it is ever built, will stretch 2,000 feet from bow to stern, longer than the Empire State Building is tall, with walls of frozen material 40 feet thick, thick enough to absorb a torpedo strike and simply keep floating. It will displace more than 2 million tons, dwarfing anything else afloat, before or since. But here, on this quiet Alberta lake, the ambition has been scaled down to something almost domestic, 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, a single horsepower motor humming away to keep it frozen through a Canadian summer. A toy beside the giant it is meant to prove. This is Project Habakkuk, and it very nearly worked. The man behind it is not a naval architect or a military engineer. He is Geoffrey Pyke, a journalist turned inventor, a man Lord Mountbatten would later compare, half admiringly and half despairingly, to a cross between Albert Einstein and a bohemian eccentric who refused to wear socks. Pyke has already survived a German internment camp during the First World War, escaping after more than 100 days in solitary confinement. Now, in the depths of the Second, he believes he has found the answer to the single greatest threat facing Britain's survival: the U-boat. Pyke had been searching for a cheap and effective way to protect vessels that were well out of reach of Royal Air Force patrols, as steel and aluminium were in short supply. And his answer was ice. Not because it was clever for the sake of being clever, because by his calculation, ice could be produced using a tiny fraction of the energy required to make the same mass in steel, at a moment when Britain had almost no steel to spare. What you are about to hear is the story of how a flying boat-sized fantasy nearly became the largest ship ever built, why it was made not of metal but of frozen wood pulp, and why, in the end, the very success of the idea is what helped make it unnecessary. By the autumn of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the most important and most desperate campaign of Britain's war. Convoys of merchant ships, the lifeline carrying food, fuel, troops, and weapons from North America to a beleaguered Britain, were being hunted by German U-boats in numbers that threatened to sever the link entirely. Winston Churchill himself would later admit that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever genuinely frightened him during the war. Losses were catastrophic. Hundreds of ships and thousands of tons of vital cargo were going to the bottom of the ocean every month, sent down by submarines operating largely unmolested in a vast stretch of open water that had become known grimly as the Mid-Atlantic Gap. The problem was simple to describe and brutally difficult to solve. Allied aircraft could hunt U-boats effectively, spotting them on the surface, forcing them to dive, dropping depth charges, denying them the freedom to maneuver into firing position. But aircraft based in Britain, Iceland, or Newfoundland could only fly so far before they had to turn back. Land-based patrol planes simply did not have the range to cover the middle of the Atlantic, that vast grey expanse of water, far from any coastline, far from any airfield. And it was precisely there, in that gap, that German submarines concentrated their attacks, picking off stragglers and entire convoys with impunity, knowing no aircraft would appear overhead to interrupt them. Existing aircraft carriers could, in theory, plug the gap. But they were desperately needed elsewhere, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, escorting invasion fleets. And Britain simply did not have steel to spare for building more. The nation's shipyards were already stretched far beyond capacity, every available ton of steel earmarked for tanks, for merchant vessels, for the carriers and battleships already under construction. Building another fleet carrier from scratch, a vessel that would take years and consume thousands of tons of scarce steel, was simply not realistic when the crisis demanded an answer measured in months. This is the context in which Geoffrey Pyke, working for the deliberately unconventional Combined Operations Headquarters under Lord Mountbatten, proposed something that sounded, on first hearing, like lunacy. What if the floating airfield needed to close the Atlantic gap did not require steel at all? What if it could be built from a substance that was, for all practical purposes, free? Water, frozen solid, in almost limitless supply across the cold waters of the North Atlantic itself. It is worth pausing on just how audacious this was. Engineers had spent decades refining the science of building ships from steel, a material with predictable strength and a century of naval architecture behind it. Pyke was proposing to abandon all of that and build the largest vessel in history from frozen water, a substance famous for one inconvenient property: it melts. Ice is also brittle. A single torpedo or well-aimed shell could shatter a conventional iceberg into 1,000 pieces. Any plan to build a warship from ice had to solve both problems at once, the melting and the shattering, or the concept collapsed before a single block was laid. The breakthrough came not from Pyke himself, who was an ideas man rather than a materials scientist, but from a young Austrian-born crystallographer named Max Perutz, working at the Royal Air Force's Department of Scientific Research and Experiment. Pyke had already stumbled upon the basic concept. Mixing wood pulp into water before freezing it produced a composite material with startlingly different properties from ordinary ice. He and his collaborators named it Pykrete, a portmanteau of his own name and concrete, and the comparison was deliberate. With wood providing reinforcement and ice acting like steel rebar, Pykrete was claimed to be stronger and more bulletproof than regular ice, and it had the added benefit of melting more slowly and refusing to sink. Perutz's job was to work out exactly why this happened and how to make it reliable enough to build a ship out of. Picture an ordinary ice cube tray. Pure ice, frozen on its own, forms large interlocking crystals, and like a sheet of glass, it shatters cleanly under impact because cracks can travel uninterrupted through the structure. Now imagine mixing roughly 14% wood pulp, sawdust essentially, into the water before it freezes. The wood fibers act like millions of tiny reinforcing rods scattered through the ice, exactly the way steel rebar reinforces concrete. When a crack tries to propagate through Pykrete, it runs into a wood fiber, loses momentum, and stops. The material does not shatter, it dents. To prove this in the most theatrical way possible, Pike arranged a demonstration in front of senior Allied commanders, including American General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the United States Army Air Forces. One bullet fired into a regular block of ice shattered it completely and sent shards of ice shrapnel flying around the room, with fragments striking onlookers. Then someone fired into the Pykrete. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly away. When Arnold himself took a hatchet to the block, the blow bounced back so violently it jarred his shoulder and made him yelp in pain, leaving barely a scratch on the material. It was the kind of demonstration that turned skepticism into fascination in the space of about 4 seconds. But Pykrete also uncovered a serious complication, one that nearly sank the entire project before construction even began. Ice, it turns out, is not perfectly rigid. Under sustained pressure, it slowly deforms, a phenomenon called plastic flow. The same property that allows glaciers to creep imperceptibly downhill over centuries. Pykrte's experiments showed that a Pykrete hull, left at typical sea temperatures, would gradually sag and lose its shape under its own colossal weight, unless it was kept reliably below -16 degrees Celsius, about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. A ship that slumped out of shape in warmer water was no use to anyone. The solution had to be mechanical rather than chemical. Every Pykrete vessel would need an outer skin of insulation to slow the transfer of heat from sun and sea, combined with an internal refrigeration plant and a network of ducting threaded through the hull, constantly pumping chilled air to hold the core temperature where it needed to be. Pykrete worked all of this out, not in some pristine laboratory, but in a secret, freezing workspace tucked beneath the Smithfield Meat Market in the City of London, conducting his experiments in a refrigerated meat locker, working behind, almost unbelievably, a protective screen made of frozen animal carcasses, hung there to muffle the sound and conceal the work from anyone who might wander too close. If the full-sized Habakkuk had ever been built, its statistics would have rewritten the record books. The proposed carrier was to be 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, and weigh more than 2 million tons, with a torpedo-proof hull 40 feet thick, equipped with 40 dual-barreled gun turrets, numerous light anti-aircraft guns, and an airstrip capable of housing up to 150 twin-engine bombers or fighters. Construction would have required staggering quantities of raw material, with even cautious estimates citing the need for at least 300,000 tons of wood pulp and tens of thousands of tons of insulation, manufactured at coastal sites in Britain and Canada under strict secrecy, the true scale known only to a small circle of scientists, engineers, and senior commanders. What was actually built on Patricia Lake in 1943 was a far humbler thing, a 60 by 30-foot test vessel, a 1/50th scale prototype weighing around 1,000 tons, framed in timber and steel and packed with embedded refrigeration pipes, hidden inside an unassuming wooden shed so that even aerial reconnaissance would struggle to identify what was being built beneath it. The men constructing it, conscientious objectors performing alternative war service, reportedly had no idea they were helping to test a secret aircraft carrier. They simply knew they were stacking strange half-frozen blocks under instruction on a remote Canadian lake, for reasons nobody explained to them. The operational record of Project Habakkuk is, by necessity, a story largely about what almost happened rather than what did. No full-sized Pykrete carrier was ever completed, So there are no combat reports, no convoy actions, no recorded encounters with U-boats to describe. What exists instead is the record of the prototype's quiet, almost anticlimactic endurance test. Through the summer of 1943, while temperatures in the Rockies climbed into the warmth of a Canadian August, the test vessel on Patricia Lake held its shape, its refrigeration system, drawing barely a single horsepower, kept the structure frozen and stable for months. It was a small, undramatic triumph, conducted far from any battlefield, but it proved the central claim true. Pykrete worked. The psychological dimension of Habakkuk, however, was never aimed at German U-boat crews because the vessel never put to sea. Instead, the project's most theatrical moments were reserved for Allied commanders themselves at conferences in Quebec, where scale models and ballistic demonstrations were used to win over skeptical American generals who controlled the steel, aluminium, and shipyards Britain needed. Americans were left impressed by the spectacle, but were not thoroughly sold on the concept, and the project was relocated to Canada for further research and development. Whatever fear the idea might eventually have struck into the crews of the Kriegsmarine remains entirely speculative because it never had the chance to be tested in anger. What can be said with confidence is that, for a brief window in 1943, senior Allied planners took the prospect of an unsinkable 2,000-foot ice carrier seriously enough to fund a working prototype, a fact that says a good deal about how desperate the U-boat crisis had become. If you are finding this story as strange and compelling as we did putting it together, a quick subscribe really does help more than you might think. Germany never attempted anything resembling Project Habakkuk. Their wartime engineering ambitions ran in a different direction entirely, towards the colossal but conventional, vast battleships like the Bismarck, built from the finest steel German industry could produce, vessels whose power came from sheer mass and gunnery, rather than unconventional materials science. There was no equivalent German program exploring frozen composites for naval construction, no parallel team of crystallographers experimenting beneath a meat market. The closest comparison is really one of contrast, where Germany solved its material shortages through conquest, seizing resources from occupied territories. Britain, increasingly isolated and stretched, was forced toward genuine material invention, looking for ways to build warships from substances the enemy could never blockade. The American response, by contrast, is well documented because it happened in front of witnesses. When Pike staged his Ice versus Pykrete demonstration in front of General Henry Arnold and other senior figures, the Americans were impressed by the display, but remained unconvinced enough to commit fully, and the project was subsequently moved to Canada for continued development rather than adopted outright by the United States. American naval planners had their own, more conventional answer to the Mid-Atlantic Gap problem already underway. Smaller escort carriers, built quickly and cheaply from existing merchant hull designs, alongside extended-range patrol aircraft fitted with additional fuel tanks. These were unglamorous solutions compared to a 2-million-ton ice fortress, but they were achievable within months rather than years, using shipyards and materials the Allies already possessed. In direct numerical comparison, the contrast is almost comic. A typical American or British fleet carrier of the period displaced somewhere between 20 and 30,000 tons and stretched a little over 800 feet. The full-sized Habakkuk, on paper, would have displaced more than 2 million tons across 2,000 feet, roughly 70 times the weight, and well over twice the length of any carrier actually built during the war. Even the prototype, dismissed by its own designers as a mere scale model, weighed 1,000 tons, a third the size of some operational escort carriers, while representing only 1/50th the scale of the intended final vessel. Nobody copied Habakkuk in the sense of building a rival ice warship, because nobody else needed to. Pykrete itself, however, did not vanish into obscurity. The basic principle that fiber-reinforced ice possesses dramatically different mechanical properties from ordinary ice has resurfaced periodically in engineering circles ever since, studied by materials scientists interested in cold region construction, occasionally referenced in discussions of polar engineering and ice road technology. It was even revisited decades later by television programs, testing whether a small Pykrete boat could actually be built and sailed, proving the underlying chemistry sound, even if the wartime ambition behind it had long since been overtaken by events. The honest assessment of Project Habakkuk's historical impact is that its significance lies almost entirely in what it represents rather than what it achieved militarily. It sank no U-boats. It saved no convoys. As a weapon, in the conventional sense, it accomplished precisely nothing because it was never finished. And yet, as a demonstration of wartime desperation and ingenuity, it remains one of the most genuinely remarkable episodes of the entire conflict. A moment when the gap between what was needed and what existing technology could provide became so wide that otherwise rational men seriously considered building the largest ship in human history out of frozen wood pulp. Its cancellation, when it came in late 1943, was not a failure of the science. Pykrete worked exactly as its inventors claimed. What killed Habakkuk was the changing shape of the war itself. New airfields established in the Azores brought land-based aircraft within range of the mid-Atlantic gap. Extended fuel tanks let existing patrol planes stay airborne over the ocean for far longer, and a growing fleet of smaller escort carriers began closing the gap using conventional construction. The very problem Habakkuk had been designed to solve was being solved by less dramatic means, faster, and at a fraction of the cost. The escalating steel requirements, the reduced need for floating airfields once land bases extended their reach, and an estimated price tag of around £10 million for a single experimental vessel combined to make the case for cancellation overwhelming. What survives today is almost defiantly modest given the scale of what was once imagined. A diving expedition to Patricia Lake in 1985 found the remains of the prototype resting on a steep underwater slope between roughly 26 and 43 meters down. The refrigeration equipment long since removed, but the timber hull walls, a tangled mass of cold air ductwork, and a substantial quantity of the bitumen insulation still scattered across the lakebed. An underwater plaque now marks the spot, and recreational divers still visit, descending into the cold, clear water of Jasper National Park to look at the scattered timber and pipework that is all that remains of the only iceberg ever deliberately built as a weapon of war. The Pykrete itself, robbed of its refrigeration, did exactly what ordinary ice eventually does. It melted, slowly taking the better part of 3 Canadian summers to finally surrender and sink. Return for a moment to that quiet shed on Patricia Lake in the summer of 1943. Inside it, a small frozen vessel holds its shape against the warming Alberta air, powered by a refrigeration motor no stronger than the engine in a modern lawnmower. It is in almost every sense an absurd image, the largest warship ever conceived, reduced to a scale model on a mountain lake, tended by laborers who have no idea what they are building or why. And yet, that absurdity is precisely the point. Project Habakkuk was never really about ice. It was about what a nation, pushed to the very edge of its material resources and facing the loss of its lifeline across the Atlantic, will seriously consider when every conventional answer has already been exhausted. Britain in 1942 did not have spare steel or spare aluminium. It did not have years to spend designing a new generation of fleet carriers while convoys went down by the dozen. What it had in apparently limitless quantity was cold seawater and the willingness of a handful of unconventional minds to ask an unconventional question. If the materials needed do not exist, can something be frozen instead? The answer, remarkably, was yes. Pykrete was real. It was stronger than steel by weight, cheaper than concrete, nearly indestructible by small arms, and buildable using little more than water, wood pulp, and patience. The science behind Habakkuk was never the weak link. Bullets bounced off it. Hatchets bruised the men who swung them more than the material they struck. A prototype survived an entire Canadian summer on a single horsepower of cooling power, less energy than a household refrigerator uses today. What ultimately defeated Habakkuk was not physics, but timing. The war moved faster than the shipyards could. By the time Pykrete had been proven and demonstrated to skeptical generals on 2 continents, the Battle of the Atlantic was already being won by other means. Longer-ranged aircraft, conventionally built escort carriers, codebreakers, improved radar, and 100 smaller innovations arriving in parallel. Habakkuk was not defeated by failure. It was overtaken by success, just not its own. Somewhere at the bottom of Patricia Lake, beneath water that turns a startling glacial blue in the Alberta sunlight, lie the wooden bones of a ship that never truly was. A fragment of an idea that briefly held the attention of Winston Churchill, Lord Mountbatten, and the assembled commanders of the United States Army Air Forces. An idea so strange, it required a biblical name to capture its audacity, drawn from a prophet promising a work so astonishing that people would refuse to believe it even when told. Nobody, looking at the chaos of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1942, would have believed that the answer might be found in a frozen lake in the Canadian Rockies, in a substance made from little more than water and sawdust. Britain never built its iceberg armada, but for one remarkable summer, it came astonishingly close and proved almost as an afterthought that with enough desperation and enough imagination, it really is possible to build something that floats and refuses to sink, out of nothing more exotic than frozen water and wood pulp. Some inventions are remembered for what they destroyed. Project Habakkuk deserves to be remembered for what it nearly became,